Well, welcome everyone again, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. I'm so delighted to have my wife with me, Roxanne, as always, especially on this in this series as we're going to be covering 1 Corinthians chapter 13, what is oftentimes called the love chapter or the Valentine's chapter, in which we hear these 15 really beautiful examples of what love is. And so we're going to be covering these almost each of them on a week-to-week basis, and we're going to get to the very first one in just a moment on being patient. But before we do so, we always want to just tell all of you that if you're interested, we send out a daily inspirational message every day. If you would love to receive one of our messages, definitely go to our website at thelouhs.com and scroll all the way down. There's an area to put an email address, your email address, and every day at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, you'll receive that day's daily inspirational message. We have all of our sermons on the Louhs YouTube page, so definitely subscribe to the Louhs YouTube page. And as always, you can check out our books, both Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, as well as 6 hours, 7 lessons, how Christ's light transforms our darkness. And so those are books that you can both find here at Ancient Faith. And so I'm so excited about this new series. We've kind of moved on from our last show and kind of doing something that we love to do every couple of years, and that is to do excuse me,
God bless you.
excuse me, a relationship series. Gosh, that kind of came out of nowhere. But to do a relationship series to kind of really guide all of us in our own marriages, in our relationships. And what better way to do than to look at this beautiful illustration that St. Paul talks about in the book of Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. He gives really what it looks like to be a Christian, I would argue, in our own faith. I mean, and obviously throughout the scriptures it does that, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it's the chapter that talks about that, if I speak in tongues and of men and of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. And then St. Paul takes that kind of message and then says, well, let's define what love looks like. And oftentimes some of the church fathers talk about that if we simply replace the word love with Christ, it kind of reminds us of what that looks like, that Christ is patient, he's kind, he does not envy, he does not boast, he's filled with humility. And so we're going to cover each of these over the next several weeks to kind of give you some help and some assistance. So definitely get out a pen and paper and take some notes. Maybe grab your spouse with you and say, hey, let's listen to the Louhs tonight. Hopefully we'll give you some tools to help you in your own walk of faith. But today is one that I know that all of us have found ourselves struggling with, not only in our own personal life, but definitely in our relationships. And that is the very first thing that St. Paul talks about, and that is love is patient. I oftentimes tell people that if patience is the very first thing that's listed, because without patience, love collapses. It is something that we have to have and what we're called to have. But in marriage, to be quite honest with you, Roxanne, and you know this in your field as a psychologist, I know this, I see this in my own, in the work at the church, is that for many of us, impatience doesn't always show up in the most obvious things like yelling. Kind of share with us some other ways that it does show up in our lives.
Well, I think what's so interesting about this, most of us would say we love our spouse, we love our children, but St. Paul does not describe love as this feeling,
Right.
this chemistry that we all, think of love as being, even the sort of romance that I would say pop psychology even makes it into. He describes it as a verb, really a way of being, and a way of, I would argue, enduring another person through grace. And so impatience, I think, as you said, if we are not patient, we really can do very little virtuous beyond that in our marriage. But impatience, for many people in their marriage, I would say it shows up as, yes, reacting, but also just subtle irritation, sarcastic thoughts or comments in reaction to someone. It can even be emotional withdrawal or shutdown from our spouse when we're frustrated or irritated by something that's making us impatient. Many of us can emotionally shut ourselves off or away from our spouse in that connection. And I would say impatience also comes up as keeping score. When we're impatient with our spouse, we're thinking, well, you didn't do this. I'm not going to do this. I can remember last time you did that.
Right.
And I would say overall, where I see this really impacting couples is this, in the flick of a dime, this critical internal narrative that shifts where we begin vilifying our partner because of their shortcomings. And that is how impatience becomes so divisive.
Right. To build on what you're sharing, Roxanne, and I love what the church fathers speak about this. And St. John Chrysostom, everyone, if you have not read he's got countless books, but there's one that he does on marriage and family. It's an extraordinary book. It's a very small book, but it's so powerful on its and the words that are on the pages. But listen to what he says. He says, "Nothing so reveals a loving soul as patience. It is the root and foundation of all virtue." So, in summary, patience is the soil in which every other marital virtue grows. So if we don't have patience, we're going to struggle with everything else in our life. And so let's define for a moment, really, what is patience? What does Paul mean when he is saying that love is patient? So the Greek word for the word patience is makrothymia. It's an amazing word, and it's so nuanced in so many different ways in the way in which it's defined. But this is the best definition that I think that it could be, and it's that it's long-tempered. In other words, it's slow to anger, it's slow to react, and slow to retaliate. And so that doesn't mean that we're passive, or we're just simply suffering in silence, or we're just simply kind of internalizing it, or even avoiding conflict. It means that choosing restraint for the sake of love, that I'm choosing to restrain myself and what my flesh wants me to do for love, for the love of our relationship.
And I'd say patience, if we're doing that, that practicing that restraint, it does something pivotal for us. And it allows us to live and operate more from a place of wisdom. Oftentimes in our state of impatience or feeling strongly, we lose that wisdom. We lose access to that wisdom, and we sort of are drawn into our fleshly natures. And so I would say patience really gives us the time that we need to reflect on a situation, to understand it, from all sides, to problem solve, and then to subsequently then be able to choose the next best step that would heal that relationship, heal that moment, rather than whatever it is our feeling is motivating within us, which oftentimes is an urge that is not healthy and could be divisive. So, most of the time it's our patience that allows us to postpone a difficult conversation until, when we're not in the heat of the moment, until our emotions are cool. And it's our patience that allows us not to turn our words into weapons. If we have that space, then we're able to regulate our tone. We're able to say what we actually mean. We can articulate better what we were actually feeling and needing, and we mediate those impulses. So we don't weaponize our anger through the silence, through the harshness, through the criticism. And so in that space, we are accessing wisdom and the work of the Holy Spirit if we can just enter into that restraint for the sake of love.
Right. If you're just tuning in tonight, we are beginning a series in which we're going to cover these 15 really virtues of what love is, that is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This is a marriage and relationship series that we're entering into, so we definitely encourage you to have your spouse with you, or if you have that significant other, to be part of this conversation. It's something that we hope and pray that we've been working on that will inspire all of you. We do a lot of retreats around the country, oftentimes on marriage, and so we've kind of compiled a lot of this stuff into this discussion, but obviously with some things that we hope are a little bit additions from those retreats. But I do encourage you, we are broadcasting live on several different platforms, everyone. We're broadcasting on Ancient Faith's YouTube page, so we encourage you, if you're at your computer now, go to Ancient Faith's YouTube page. We're broadcasting there. You can leave a comment. There's a chat room going, so I already see our dear friends that are there every single week, and so thanks for all of you that are tuning in, as well as we're broadcasting on both St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church, our parish, on their Facebook page. The Louhs Facebook page are also there. So leave comments there, friends. We'd love to get to those. And you can always call in during the live broadcast of our show by calling in at 1-855-237-2346. So, Roxanne, let's spend a little bit of time really talking about the triggers behind why many of us struggle with being patient. And so I know that one of the things that I think happens is a lot of us like to control things. So I think number one would be that, we're expecting immediate change instead of a lifelong growth. So we're expecting our spouse to do the things that we want them to do at that time whether it be, or to think the way we want them to think at that time, to do what we want them to do. And when they don't do that, it obviously creates tension within a relationship, but also creates that level of impatience in a relationship. And I think sometimes if we're not careful in a relationship, we're trying to fix our spouse to be more like us, not realizing that God has created each and every one of us uniquely in his own image and likeness.
So we think about Ephesians, bear with one another in love, and I think if we think about that, really bearing with one another, that really means, walking side by side with that individual, helping to carry what it is that they carry. And if we think of marriage as this unique union that God has established in order to help us both, be a sanctifying process, I would argue, in our life to sort of meet Christ in that the best possible way. We're encouraging each other's spiritual growth all along the way. We're helping each other on that road to salvation. And so, we really don't want to enter marriage with the notion that I'm here to change you, fix you. I'm up here, you're down here, and I can really see all of these areas of growth that you need, and I'm going to weaponize those weaknesses, and I'm going to abandon you emotionally when you fail, and I'm going to keep correcting you until you get it right. That does not set up the type of safety and parameters and foundation in a marriage that we need to actually grow. And I would argue that, a lot of times we think of love as this sort of situation where I can change this other person. And, quite honestly, change is so hard. It can take years, not months, not weeks, as many of the New Year's resolutions say. And that's when somebody actually wants that change. And most of the time in marriage, it is a spouse insisting on a change for their partner that partner is not necessarily yearning for themselves.
Or even recognized as a problem.
Even recognized. But I would say, while we know that skills can change and be improved, we know that behavior can gradually shift. We also know that core personality traits that shape people's personality, like our temperament, our disposition, our conscientiousness, our level of openness, our extroversion, those things are relatively stable over time. And I think a lot of times in marriage, we have these unrealistic expectations over the things that are unlikely to change in our partner. And then we have the things that can change. We have these unrealistic timelines over the things that we expect to be different. And truthfully, when we find ourselves the most impatient, it's because we're demanding this level of change over personality rather than just behavior. And we're not coming at it from a place of, how this affects me and what I feel and what I need. We're coming at it from a place of you're wrong. And you need to be right. And that just creates a lot of defensiveness and doesn't welcome somebody's growth.
Right. And not only that, it really, puts off of what the things that we need to be working on internally.
Right.
And kind of puts that off on the other person, blaming them for not getting the things done that they needed to get done, or if they've in some way not fulfilled an expectation that we've had, then we get upset with them. And I love what St. Basil the Great says. He says, do not demand perfection from your brother. Listen to that. Do not demand perfection from your brother. Seek endurance within yourself. So really what's happening is that instead of us always looking at how I can change Roxanne or how Roxanne can change Nick, it's more about, okay, God, change me. Help me to become the man that you want me to be. Help Roxanne to become the woman of faith that you yearn for her to be, as opposed to me trying to mold and to fix them. So I think one of the things that we struggle with, one of the triggers for us in impatience, is that we expect people to change instead of recognizing that change is a lifelong process. Here's number two. I thought that was something quite interesting. As I think for oftentimes, Roxanne, and you could speak a great deal about this, is that I think for many of us, we don't realize all of that we are a summation of all of the experiences that we've had, both good and bad. And so whenever we're in a relationship, listen, friends, you're going to bring that, whatever's been part of your life, whatever's been part of the different chapters of your life, you're going to bring that into a marriage, into a relationship. And so for some of us, we have wounds that have never been healed. We have struggles that we have both within our own personal life, maybe things that we saw within our parents, within our families, that we are bringing into that relationship. And if we're not careful, we can allow that trauma, those wounds that happened in our life, to be part of a new relationship. That's why we talk about sometimes in the Orthodox Church, we talk about a generational sin, where if things that are not managed or not aware of, they could be brought in from not just in what you're dealing with, but now you can start getting someone else who was never part of that initial struggle to be now impacted by that.
Yeah. And so, when we hear about, the scripture, everyone knows the scripture, carry each other's burdens. What we don't see is that a few verses later, we hear, but also, carry your own load, so as to not be an unnecessary burden on others. And so this is self-awareness. We need to know what we are bringing to a relationship, to a marriage, and the things that, I would say irritate us the most in our spouse are often touching on this sort of unresolved pain. And in that case, then our impatience is often our own nervous system really overwhelmed by this unhealed memory. And that memory is trying to demand protection in that moment. And so, perhaps your spouse, maybe grew up in a home, where anger or upset meant yelling. It meant unpredictability, and it meant this sort of bouts of emotional shutdown, right? So now in a marriage, if your partner becomes slightly frustrated by something, your nervous system might be reacting so strongly to this perceived threat that it causes you to be immediately defensive, causes you to shut down, or causes this sort of explosion. And in this case, we remember St. Maximus, where he says, "He who knows himself is slow to condemn another."
I love that. It's so powerful what he's saying, because, and I think that's so key, Roxanne, is the knowing of ourselves, knowing how and what we experienced as a child. Even if we saw something happen with our parents and the way in which they communicated, or maybe we have a lot of families that come from broken homes. What were the reasons why that divorce took place, and maybe that fear gets transferred to that child, who, when that child grows up and wants to find that special person, that's also permeating into that new relationship.
I mean, and listen, there were a lot of parents who, the language around needs and emotions, and I would say all the foundational work of emotional intelligence wasn't really even a conversation 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so many people grew up where, the needs of the child didn't necessarily go noticed, right?
You were to keep it to yourself.
Yeah. And so those individuals can oftentimes grow up, and then if somebody forgets something that was important to them, suddenly they become reactive when their partner forgot something small, because they think, I always come last.
Right.
My needs never matter.
Right.
And so I once heard it said like this: if it's hysterical, it's historical. In other words, when we are really emotional about something, chances are there's that historical backdrop behind it. And knowing that from ourselves can really help patience in marriage.
I love that. Here's number 3, again, just areas that trigger us in our impatience. So I think number 3 would be that we confuse control with love. So we sometimes can just simply say, we can become impatient when our spouse doesn't respond quickly enough, or when you are in an argument, they simply don't respond the way in which you would want them. Like, I want to talk about this. No, I don't want to talk. The other person may say, well, no, I don't want to talk. I'm not ready to talk about that. And that becomes an issue of arguments. Or we want them to act the way in which we expect them to act. And it kind of goes to what we were mentioning earlier.
Or we want them to feel the way we think they should feel.
Right.
And how often have we heard someone say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Why are you so torn up about that? It's not that big of a deal.
Right.
Immediately minimizing somebody else's experience, in that level of impatience, this can make feelings intensify because somebody doesn't feel understood. And we need to allow feelings without rushing to some sort of resolution. And paradoxically, this sort of calms things down. But when we try to control somebody else's experience of an emotion, we oftentimes see this sort of escalation.
I love that. Roxanne, I'm just kind of curious when you're seeing, because I think all of us in some way, shape, or form struggle with control, whether it is trying to, not necessarily always in a relationship, but even in that, I think that we want kind of people to be the way we want them to be. But how impactful, does that level of control, it comes from a need that's probably based a great deal in fear. And maybe just talk a little bit about like how that fear could be based on our past. It could be based on what we worry about in the future. It could be based upon things. So, just talk a little bit about that, because I think sometimes that as we're controlling because of the impatience, that in some ways becomes the symptom, but really the problem it's much deeper.
Yeah, it's that nervous system that is activated and feels overwhelmed by something in its environment. Something, could have been chaotic, could have been strong emotions outside of them, could have been a situation that they fear could create these strong emotions. And really, it's because this nervous system is so overly active, and the threshold for reactivity is much lower. And so in these particular individuals, you see them oftentimes trying to manage everything, trying to control how everything goes, or how their partner feels, or what they say, or what they do, because it's this fear that I won't be able to hold or manage the big emotion that's going to be activated within me if this goes wrong or you're upset. And so they try to manage everything. And so that, what we don't realize is that sort of patience is what not the control, but that patience that increases emotional safety, and leads to real change. And control actually induces a lot more resentment, especially if you're not on the same page with the values you're trying to manage. And so there's a lot that has to be sort of talked about, with regards to that.
And I think too, and this goes without saying, is that for a lot of people, one of the reasons why we are impatient is because we're just simply tired.
Yes.
We're tired with what's going on in our own personal life, and tired with what maybe a situation may have been that hasn't been resolved. We're just physically and emotionally tired. And I oftentimes tell people that the enemy of this world will always speak the loudest in your life when you are the tiredest in your life. Because when you are tired, you will sin more. You will find yourself more distant from God, and your emotions are all over the place. And so we see this happening so often in relationships when people are tired. And often, I think it's one of those things, Roxanne, that, how we hear throughout the scriptures where, Christ oftentimes would take time to simply rest. And I think it's so important in a relationship for us to talk about, the importance for rest. And I'm not talking about just like resting where you're watching a football game, but a genuine rest that allows you to really connect with Christ. We talk about this a lot, where the word Sabbath, the Hebrew word is Shabbat, but that word, one of the definitions is to simply stop, but stop by resting under Christ, being under the covering of Christ. And so making sure that we're finding that, because what's happening so often, as we're talking about, is that if you've had a bad day at work, you need to unload on something or someone, and sometimes we'll either unload it on ourselves with really poor ways of self-medicating ourselves, or we're going to unload on someone else.
So I love when Jesus says to the disciples, come away and rest for a while. And I remember reading, as I read the Gospels, just how often Jesus would go outside of the walls of the city to pursue stillness, he would get up early in the morning and go out on his own to connect with the Father. And, I'm always reminded of how often he was moving away from things in order to seek that peace in that union, in that connection with God. And I think so often when we are so busy and we're so exhausted, we don't have that quiet. We're not seeking that same space and stillness where we can come away and actually hear ourselves think and even know what's wrong. Because when we get angry, we get impatient, we don't even know if it was the situation itself that was upsetting to us and that sparked us, or if it was how I was doing, the 12 hours leading up to that moment that sparked me in that impatience. And so then we start fighting about that issue, and that's actually not the issue. And so that, again, coming back to knowing ourselves, how am I actually doing? And I think, that's huge. And we deny that. And I love what St. Isaac the Syrian says. He says, do not rebuke anyone when you are tired, for even truth spoken without love becomes sin. If that doesn't hold us accountable to not going after somebody when we're not in a good state, I don't know what would. I mean, that's just written so much wisdom in that, packed in that one statement.
Absolutely. And when you look at oftentimes when there is arguments, we're not even getting to the way that the arguments oftentimes unfold, but when someone says something like that in a moment of frustration, fatigue, oftentimes it's met equally with that same level of response, maybe even elevated a little bit. And then what ends up happening is you're in an argument, and we don't realize we never really cover the topic that we needed to cover. What was the underlying symptom of the fact that, look, I'm tired and I need to better know myself, and what I need is a break, is a moment of just, or some time to really just kind of pause and be still, to kind of just think about what's going on in my life. So I think that, there's an old saying that was said that if the devil can't make you sin, he'll just make you busy.
Exactly.
And
this is important to recognize even in our spouse. Our spouses might, out of good intention, want to keep showing up for us, and you can just see the exhaustion, overtaking them, and that even though they're really wanting to be present, to watch that movie or to go for that bike ride or to go on that walk, as a spouse, wanting their good, it's okay to even kind of take a look and say, I know you want to spend that time with me, but where's your body at? Is your body in a space where that's something within your reach and your capacity? And I think those sort of moments where we help our spouse in that way, or, we see them, when they're making the sigh, when they're emptying the dishwasher or doing the laundry, you just hear the exhaustion, that's the moment to kind of step in, and take that as they're physically exhausted and likely spiritually depleted, because those oftentimes they go hand in hand.
I love that. And that's going to tee up the second half of this show. We're going to take a quick break. You do not want to leave our show, because we're going to be spending some time giving you really 4 practical ways to apply patience in your relationship. Listen, if Paul is mentioning patience as the very first thing, and he says love is patient, it's because out of that, everything else comes out. So let's get this right, everyone, especially in this new year. So stay right with us here. We're going to give you 4 practical ways to apply patience in your marriage.
During his darkest moments on the cross, Jesus uttered 7 statements. His words offer us principles to live by, lessons of hope, peace, and comfort. I'm Dr. Roxanne Lowe.
And I'm Father Nicholas Lowe.
And our new book, 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, is all about how Christ's light transcends our darkness.
Christ's final words have the power to bring us into the light of his love and protection, providing wisdom and direction to follow when we face our own dark seasons. Get your copy today by going to store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Live with the Louhs. We're so grateful that you're joining us. Real quick, Robert, before we get back to our program, we do want to remind all of you that if you're interested in our daily inspirational messages, you can find them by going to thelouhs.com. Simply scroll all the way down. So it's the Louhs, LOUHS.com. Scroll all the way down. There's going to be an area where you can simply put in your email address. And tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, you'll receive that day's daily inspirational message. We also encourage you, if you have not yet, to subscribe to the Louhs YouTube channel. We have a lot of different videos there, a lot of our sermons that are there that I hope and pray will be beneficial to all of you. So definitely subscribe to that. And as always, we're broadcasting on Ancient Faith YouTube right now, and on the Louhs and on St. Anna Divine Greek Orthodox Church's Facebook pages. So we're in this series that we're launching today that's all about 1 Corinthians chapter 13, in which we're going specifically in defining these 15 areas that Paul talks about what love is. And we've been talking about how love is a verb. It's not something that, it's something that requires an action. And the very first thing that he utters in this is that love is patient. And we kind of shared early on what those 4 areas of what we think are some of the areas that we struggle with that are triggers for our impatience. Now we want to give you 4 areas that I hope and pray will inspire all of you to be more patient in your relationships, because everything flows out of this level of being patient in a relationship. So here's number 1. This is one thing I would tell you all to do, and let's write this down, is I want you to pause before you react, okay? Well, we're going to call this the holy pause for a moment, okay? So I want you to pause before you react. So before you do anything, before you say anything, breathe any certain way that may be seen as a sign of impatience, whatever, just simply pause before you react. Have that holy pause.
So, and going back to James, which we just did, a series on, James 1:19 says, everyone should be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Mm-hmm. And just take that in, like quick to hear. How many of us, when we are reacting to somebody, are not necessarily hearing. We are preparing our reaction. We are already analyzing what's wrong about what's been said, what's flawed about this person before me, and we're already getting anger. And he's saying, hey, slow down, listen, right? The speech can wait. The anger can wait. And I think so often, why is that pause hard? It's because we think we have to fix everything or respond to everything in that one moment, and that it's going to somehow go away if we don't, nip it in the bud in that moment. And, what I think we often miss is that the wisdom comes later in the processing and letting the Holy Spirit work through you, in this situation, through the both of you. Reflection happens when we are not adding to the fire. In fact, that's what makes somebody more reflective in their own experience. And I see this regularly in couples when I encourage the one to just stop, engaging. You see this level of reflection and ownership, and then repair. Apologies even come. But yet when that other spouse was responding, defensive, coming back, it was escalating. Nobody was apologizing and nobody knew who was at fault because things had gotten so bad. And so, I think we have to think about the patience. It begins before words are spoken. And it's not because, it's this, we have to really interrupt what I would say is this sort of instinctive reaction. And we have to decide in that moment two things. One, I don't have to handle it right now. I don't have to say it all right now. I don't have to fix this all right now. I don't have to change anything right now. And I'm going to invite God into that moment. And so that's the sort of holy pause.
Right.
It's like less of me, more of him.
Right. And as we're talking about this, I think for many of us, just to look at your own lives and look at your own relationships. I really would like, as we're talking during this series, is just to think about your own marriage and your relationships. Most times when people come to us for marriage counseling or for marriage guidance, when they bring up the problems that are happening in their relationships, listen, oftentimes they're not bringing to us the specific argument. What they are bringing up is what the words that were said in that argument that were so hurtful. So words that were said out of impatience, words that were hurtful, demeaning, discounting of them. And so I love, what we oftentimes like to try to do is not just give you, what faith and psychology obviously share, but really to kind of give it to you in our own perspective, in our own marriage. And that's one of the things that we have to be really intentional of, is because the two of us, on paper are both a priest and a psychologist. And sometimes, the idea is that, oh, well, you guys will kind of know these things, but marriage requires work, everyone. And it requires that, Nick, sometimes you don't react. You pause. You have that moment of pause. And I love how St. Isaac the Syrian says this. He says, a man who has not learned silence has not yet learned patience. So a man who has not learned silence, in other words, to keep ourselves quiet, not only verbally, but also non-verbally, in the way, because sometimes we communicate obviously with our non-verbals, our heavy breathing, our shutting of the doors or whatever, or slamming of the doors. But a man who has not learned silence, has not learned to be silent, has not learned yet to be patient. So really encouraging you all just to kind of do that. So, I think a great thing to do, Roxanne, maybe you can kind of share with our listeners, is just some things that they could practically do to do just that.
Yeah, I want to go to that, but I want to first get to this question that just came in. Susan asks, is it okay to temporarily ignore what is being said in order to pause before reacting negatively? And this is such a great question because, here's the discernment. How do I know how engaged and connected to remain in a conversation depends on how much what is coming at me is healthy, is healing, is repair attempts, is problem solving, is perspective taking, or is it harsh words, criticism, defensiveness, blame shifting, deflecting? If we get any of those sort of what we call red flags of conflict, where people are not utilizing tools and what they are saying is really beginning to charge our nervous system, it is okay, in fact, helpful to disengage as you're there, because you don't want to take in all of that toxicity, because if you do, it affects how you then choose to respond. And as you disengage from that, the toxicity coming at you, you really want to be praying for that person, right? You're praying for God to sort of enter that headspace, their heart space, to open them up to heal in this space, and you want to give time because they're not ready. What that tells me is they're not ready. And so you really have to be discerning on if I can stay connected, and if my nervous system is calm enough, that's generally speaking a sign that what is coming at you is healthy, is workable. And when it's not, our nervous system lets us know. Our amygdala sort of activates that threat center. And we actually go into the ability to not hear well. And we actually, all of the processes in our body are armed for fight and protecting ourselves, not protecting the relationship. So it's very hard to stay and listen when those things are not happening and when the words of the person around you are weaponized words and they're not instruments of healing. And so in that pause, I would say we breathe deeply when someone's talking. You can be praying for that person as they're talking. And then, we talk about 3 major checkpoints, to go through before you even bring up something that you're upset about with your spouse. Like, who am I in this space? What do I bring to this moment that I'm upset about? What maybe set me up to get upset about this? And what good exists in my partner outside of this thing they did that upsets me? So we're really trying to humanize the person that we're speaking to and remember their goodness. And then we're looking at the situation, like what can we learn from that situation? What was it about this situation that, was there a value? Was there a need? Was there something I hoped for? So I really want to be productive with kind of passing through all those checkpoints before I ever bring my anger to somebody. So you can imagine that all takes time. And that's why that pause is helpful.
Right. And, in building on what you're sharing, Roxanne, is the questions like, help me to understand what you're feeling or what you're sharing. That's a powerful thing to say. In other words, when you kind of enter their world, you may not totally agree with it. You may not even think that that's what's happening. But if we're truly looking at the fact that as the church fathers speak about this, that, we are responsible for helping to sanctify our spouse, to make them holy. Well, we should be modeling that even at times when the flesh part of us, when the earthly part of us wants to kind of give them a piece of our mind or get back to them or give them, to get angry with them, but rather say, wait a minute, let me have this holy pause. Let me say, Lord, have mercy. Let me just pause, maybe take a few moments of silence, but simply going back into that situation with, okay, help me understand something, as opposed to saying, you don't care about this, or defining what their intention is as opposed to how you're feeling. So it's important to remember that. Talk more about what you're feeling and how you're and what you're wanting to understand as opposed to what they're doing wrong. It's a very important thing to kind of help.
Absolutely. And most of the time what people are angry about or saying to you or about you, remember, you don't have to agree with all of it. You just have to seek to understand where they're coming from, how they heard something, what you did, how they took it, what they took it to mean. That's all you're doing. You're like a detective trying to figure out, hey, where did you come at this from? Like, how did you see that? And I'm really not needing to necessarily defend myself as much as I am uncovering who they are because of how they heard it, because of what they saw, because of what and you can learn so much about people in that pause if our patience and our pause allows us to seek that level of understanding.
Right. And that brings us to number 2, Roxanne, is seek to understand, not to win. And that's extremely important because I think for a lot of us, we are looking to try to win the argument. What we don't realize is that it's hurting the relationship. And I love what St. Paul says in the book of Philippians. He says, let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. So patience grows when we shift from self-defense to other awareness.
And this is such a big concept, I think, in today's world. The lack of other awareness. This notion of, let me see this situation from all perspectives. And I don't know what's really fostering that. I'm not sure if it's this sort of focus on the me movement. But I think we have lost, many of us as human beings in this sort of civilized world have sort of lost this perspective of others. In general, you can't solve any problem unless you fully understand where everyone is on that situation, how they're seeing it, what was important to them, what it meant to them. This is what builds emotional safety in relationships, by the way. Trust is built when we know our spouse is going to predictably listen to us and make room to understand our perspective in that situation, whether they agree with it or not, isn't important, but that they sought to understand it and why we arrived at feeling what we felt. And this is what de-escalates conflict. And we know in persuasion research that most people will not move from a position until they have first felt completely and utterly and deeply understood. And so that's why we spend so long in counseling spaces and really trying to deeply understand where somebody's coming from. And you learn so much about who they are, based on that level of understanding. And it's just not something we do in everyday, relationships.
Right. And I think, to St. John Chrysostom says this, he says, to listen with patience is greater than to speak with wisdom. So I think that, I think the key for us is to recognize that, wait a minute, let me give that person, let me try to understand what they're going through. Let me not always try to win, because I think sometimes even in arguments, Roxanne, people say, even the argument could be about the fact that you always want to win. That becomes, an argument that people, or you won't give up until you win. But the idea is to say, wait a minute, let me just kind of take a step back. Let me just understand better what they're doing. So instead of, that's not what I meant, hearing is more to say, I can see how that hurt you. So instead of defending yourself when that person is sharing with you what they're feeling, is that the response could be, instead of saying, well, that's not what I meant, and get into an argument about that, but really go, okay, I don't know how, I see how you got there, and and I could see how, based upon how you got that, how it made you feel that way. You journey with him through that.
And what's amazing about what you're saying is that we actually can't do that unless we've really done the help me understand how you took it that way, what it meant to you. If we're not really listening for that, we can't do that second part where we say, I didn't intend to hurt you, but now that you've explained how you see it, I can see why it hurts. If I can't get to, I can see why it hurt now that I've heard you, it's because I didn't hear you. So if you're having trouble with the validating piece, it may mean that, you're not doing the first step, which is to really listen and understand what it meant. I've heard couples say, gosh, this just keeps coming up and I'm so tired of talking about it. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, why does it keep coming up? What we need to be asking in that situation is, help me understand what part of this I'm not understanding. Like, why does it still feel so unresolved for you? There's information that we need. And so that piece, I would say, empathic listening is all about engaging, not interrupting, reflecting back what you hear, asking a lot of help me understand questions, and validating that emotion, validating their experience. Again, this is not agreement. This is just understanding of how they could have arrived there based on what they're saying.
So here's an exercise that I think would be helpful for all of us, and that is allow your spouse to speak for 3 minutes without interruption about a frustration that they have, okay? Then the other spouse repeats what they heard being said as that frustration, and then switch the roles. So one person speaks about a frustration they have without the other person interrupting them, and then the spouse who's listening to this frustration repeats what they're hearing, and basically using, as Roxanne was just sharing, help me understand this. So they state that, and then instead of defending that, your response is, I can see how, based upon your trajectory of how you are putting those thoughts together, how you got to this, and summarize that, and then switch those roles. It really helps to practice really active listening in our relationships. I know this sounds kind of silly, but to be honest with you, I oftentimes wonder, friends, how many arguments could have been resolved so much sooner if the couple just simply practiced this idea of, help me understand this. Let me just enter into your world. I don't have to necessarily agree with it, but let me just help me understand how you got to that point. It helps me to understand you better, how you actually process things better, and then being able to say, okay, this is what I heard you say, and it allows that person to feel validated, to feel loved, and to feel like, we're a partner in that relationship. Because I know you, Roxanne, just probably all the time. this is probably one of the biggest areas that people struggle with in marriages, with coming into counseling, is that they've lost the ability to do that. And when they do say, "Well, Father Nick, I'll listen to them," they're not listening with their eyes. They're either breathing heavy. They're kind of looking. I've had people in my office that are, the couple is the spouse may be talking about how they're feeling, and the husband's looking at the wall, looking up at the ceiling, doing all these other things.
Or even if they're maintaining eye contact, they're not listening with their heart.
Right. So
the heart's not open.
So we want to, when we're talking about this, friends, we want you to be very intentional about actually looking at that person, engaging that person. That person is not your enemy. That person is your partner that God has put in your life. So let's work on that, okay?
And notice that empathic listening, requires patience, right? But in the response that we get and the information that we receive through empathic listening, it actually fuels our ability to be patient, because we start to see the soul of the person that we are vilifying, angry at, frustrating. We see the depth of who they are beneath that moment. And that fuels our patience, because we suddenly can feel things like compassion. We can see Christ in them. We can see the brokenness, the weakness, the value or the need underneath that person. And so it's much more easy to connect to them. And so that fuels our patience in the conflict.
Right.
So it really works both ways.
Right. Here's number 3, friends. We want you to shift from why to what. And that's what you hear us talking about a lot, especially when we're talking about areas of in which we're dealing with maybe a vice that we're struggling with, or maybe in an area of our life where we're dealing with fear or lack of trust. But this is a little bit different. In this situation, we want you to shift, because so many times people say, "Well, Father Nick, why is my spouse not changing? Why are they not getting better?" And in those moments, I just want you to realize that marriage is an ascetical training. Okay, so when people say to me, "It should not be this hard in a marriage," and I'm like, no, it should be. Marriage requires work. And sometimes the work is not just about the spouse. It's really, what are you trying to work in me, God? So it's not always why, God, is he not moving, or why is he not changing, but what, God, are you trying to teach me? What do I need to be learning in this about myself? What are the things that I need to be adding into my toolbox of how I need to be as a Christian man of faith or woman of faith? What are you trying to teach me, God?
So, I think we have to really look at discomfort in marriage as, interpreting it meaningfully. And I think that's when really growth occurs, and our patience really transforms our frustration into growth and I would say godly formation. This is where he's working on us. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. I think so often we are granted a spouse, interestingly enough, that can sharpen us where we often need sharpening. And so I think, if we're able to, ask ourselves, God, what are you teaching me? And with humility, we really open our hearts to that. And one thing I might say, just as an practical application, is to ask yourself, what tests my patience most frequently? Each week, daily, what are the situations that really test my patience? And then ask yourself, okay, what virtue could God be cultivating in me through that moment? Like, what could he be yearning to cultivate within me through this moment? And this is something really just important to kind of reflect on within yourself. But, oftentimes, where we are the most impatient is oftentimes a space where God needs to enter. A virtue needs to enter. A more generous interpretation may need to enter. Perhaps I need to think of it as not all about me, and maybe I'm taking things personally that aren't about me. I'm getting really impatient here. There's so much that we have to work on. And so this is where work with your spiritual father is important. Areas where you are really tested in patience. Or work with a Christian counselor who can really help you mindfully connect to the spaces where you get most frustrated, most impatient, but in a way that's meaningful and productive for your growth, not necessarily like venting about how bad somebody is because of this situation I have to endure.
I love that. That's really,
it's a bit
really
of a different take on it. Yeah.
And it kind of goes to what I was reading, what St. Maximus the Confessor says. He says, God allows trials through others so that love may be purified of selfishness. So when we go through those trials that we're experiencing, and when we actually look, okay, God, what are you trying to teach me? There's a level of of my way becomes purified, and we become more focused on our way. So maybe that the issue is not that we're in any way diminishing what a problem may be, but we're also challenging you, okay, that while we're also trying to deal with this issue this other issue, let's also deal with ourselves. Like, God, maybe I need to be more merciful, more compassionate, more kind. And sometimes, let me be honest with you, friends, you may not be the right person to answer that question. To your point, Roxanne, I think that's where a therapist, a spiritual father, I would argue a spiritual father before, would be helpful to really go deep diving on that and to really think about, okay, is what I'm thinking, to give me that discernment to really reflect on, am I really looking at this through that lens of purity, or am I still looking through a level of selfishness? And so, I think that, Roxanne, I think for all of us, what we're trying to do is just journey through life, recognizing that God has blessed us with a spouse, and that we become like a mini church, and we're supposed to lead each other. In the Orthodox Church, one of the beautiful parts about the service itself is that we're both wearing, crowns, and these crowns are, yes, that we're the king and the queen of our families, but we're also dying of our own individual selves, because and so it's less about me, it's more about that even though Roxanne and I are totally different people, we have very different things that we are. I mean, we tease each other. I mean, we have so many things in common, but the things that we're different about are, Roxanne's much more of an introvert. I'm someone that I'm much more of an extrovert. And those kind of just different things that we are as a people. But when I can sit there and say, let me enter into her world, instead of trying to make her into my image, simply allow her to be who God wants her to be. Let me work with what God has done. That it takes a level of humility, a level of patience to do that. But wow, how we're honoring God by doing just that. And so I encourage you to do this. We're hoping that these things are really helping you. And then number 4, the final thing I would tell you is, and we could talk about this all night, but I think the number 4 would be, today is to cultivate doing little micro acts of patience. Cultivate daily doing micro acts of patience with your spouse. So I love in the Gospel of Luke, it says, whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. So, patience is not just built when you are having an argument with your spouse. It's in the little things like, we typically like to being on time, or patience maybe in driving. Sometimes Roxanne will tell you this, that I have a lead foot. I can go 0 to 60 quite fast. And sometimes, she'll say, Nick, I need you to slow down. Well, the old Nick would be like, well, I need to get there. We have to get there fast, But the reality behind that is that, wait a minute, let me kind of enter into her world, that although that this is something that is these little small things, these little mini things that we can practice patience with. And what I have found that oftentimes when we do that, there's a level of like ease that happens actually within the entire car. So this is just one example, but I mean, just practice small micro acts of patience every day. And I think that, you'll start seeing a change in your relationship that way.
Absolutely. So, if you're thinking about your own marriage, where could I sort of practice these more micro daily acts? Think about minor irritations, not big ones, but think about the minor irritations. The big ones I usually say are areas of necessary for healing, because there are values that need to be discussed there. But the minor irritations, which of these could I let go of? Could I just not bring up? Perhaps it's a dispositional part of character, a stable aspect of who they are, unlikely to change over time. It is not going to be helpful to continue to point those things out. So, letting go of the sort of minor irritations that we kind of subtly condemn in other people would be a source. I would say also choose kindness, even when you're tired, choosing to do something kind, as a good deed in your day for somebody that, maybe you wouldn't normally or ordinarily do this for your spouse, but really what's one kind thing that I could kind of put on each day in a new way, that sort of serves even when I'm tired. And I would say, maybe choosing to respond gently instead of sarcastically. I think those of us who have, a habit of sort of reacting with sarcasm or cutting remarks, really trying to sort of put on gentleness in that moment instead, or even, choosing not to criticize something.
Right.
That's a huge one.
We don't have to be so opinionated about everything that our spouse does.
Yeah. And wait, I think so often as a culture, all of us, myself included, can become so impatient. And one of the best ways, to put on patience every day is to wait when you could otherwise rush. And when you can otherwise, get into that other line in the grocery that's moving just a little bit quicker, choose to wait. Like, what do you gain in the wait? Oftentimes you gain a moment to pray. You gain a moment of peace, a moment of stillness, a moment to reflect. If you get up to the line sooner, you're engaging with the cashier sooner, you're looking at the numbers, so again, like engaging those little microscopic moments of patience, get somewhere a little bit early so you can just kind of sit and wait, park a little bit farther away. Wow. That took an extra 5 minutes to get into the grocery store, but yes, I could just walk and appreciate the beauty of what's around me. And so I think, and one of the other areas I would say for patience is when you find yourself in a marriage feeling the same feeling over and over and over. Maybe, it's not feeling heard or feeling criticized by your spouse. Try to choose a different response, right? Same feeling. I'm going to have a different response than I typically would. Perhaps in that situation, I'm going to pray for my spouse instead of trying to condemn them or get angry or be defensive. I'm just going to stay quiet. I'm going to pray for them. I'm going to ask God to work in this moment because everything I've been doing has not worked, is not working. So asking God to enter that space. Or the other piece we could do, try a different response. How about trying to make a generous interpretation of why that person may struggle with this? Again, is it dispositional? Is that how they were raised? Do they not have better tools for knowing how to better do it? So trying to make that more generous interpretation will help you to feel more compassionate. So again, patience in the microscopic moments of the day is really looking at those same feelings that are created over and over again in your marriage and really trying to choose a different response that required a bit more patience on your part.
Right. And I think we have to realize that, patience is like a muscle. It's something that you have. It's something that you have to actually practice. And so I think so many of the things that we're going to be talking about over the next several weeks really require us to daily put on this in our lives. And so as we're, looking at this very first virtue that we are called to have of being patient, look for ways that you could practice that level of patience in your relationship. And we talked about a lot of them, but instead of criticizing, pause in that moment. Instead of always trying to correct someone, just be encouraging. That we would just simply wait instead of demanding someone to do something for us. These are all things that I hope and pray will allow us to kind of be much more patient, but also recognizing that the author of patience is our Savior. The Bible says that Christ is slow to anger. He's abounding in patience for us. So let us kind of
the tempo.
Right. And so let's really work on that, friends. Let's really do all that we can to put on Christ this year, especially in this in our relationships, and specifically tonight on this being patient. So look for opportunities over the next several days for you to be patient with your spouse, and let us know how it's going. You can always send us an email. At the Louhs at ancientfaith.com. So definitely do that. Or you can do it through our shows or on joining our Louhs Facebook page. And again, Roxanne, always a great time to just kind of talk and to share our marriage, our 23 years of marriage, and our experiences with our listeners. It's always a pleasure to have you with me as well. And also thank you all for being here with us as well. Thanks to Simon and to Michael Degan for producing, as they do every single week, tonight's show. And join us next week as we continue this series by talking about how are we able, or can we be better, be kind towards our spouses. You don't want to miss next Tuesday's show. God bless you, everyone, and stay strong in your faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of their books Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, and 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, How Christ's Light Transcends Our Darkness, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with The Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.